Ah yes, Saturday Night Slam Masters, Capcom's cult favourite wrestling game, whereby you could choose to play as everyone's favourite vigilante mayor, Mean Mike Haggar. The internet this channel included is rife with stories celebrating the Street Fighter franchise's success and impact, with Street Fighter 2 and its iterations being the crown jewels in Capcom's crown. What some may not necessarily realise though is that the canonical universe, where the cast of these colourful characters live, expands out further to encompass events that took place outside of the games, that just had the name Street Fighter in the title. This includes the beloved title known as Saturday Night Slam Masters, Capcom's punt at conquering the wrestling genre, utilising the skills they had tuned whilst developing Street Fighter 2. This video will not only be discussing how different Capcom franchises are interlinked, but the wrestling game's similarities with Street Fighter 2, the impact this classic had on the world, and why it is still considered special today. In fact, as well known as this all-time great is, with legions of fans praising its name, what is also interesting is that there was an entire Saturday Night Slam Masters arcade trilogy. So amongst our journey, we shall be looking at all of them and why the later games fly under the radar. So without further ado, hello ladies and gentlemen, Big Daddy Top Hat here. This is the history of the Saturday Night Slam Masters trilogy. Yeah. The year is 1993. Capcom are still on top of the world after the release of Street Fighter 2, 2 years prior. This was the year they would release Super Street Fighter 2, the third arcade update the game would receive, which would see the game have 4 new characters added, along with a series of other notable updates. They would release other arcade games that year too though, such as Cadillacs and Dinosaurs, The Punisher, and of course the subject of this video, the chaotic Saturday Night Slam Masters. The title first released in Japanese arcades in July of that year, under the title Muscle Bomber, The Body Explosion, was Capcom's take on the pro wrestling genre. 1993 was an odd year for pro wrestling, as the World Wrestling Federation, the global force in sports entertainment, was in the process of going through a significant scandal. Basically, chairman of the company, Vincent Kennedy McMahon, was indicted in federal court after steroid controversy engulfed the promotion, forcing him to temporarily cede control of the WWF to his wife Linda. To put it simply, Vince was accused of distributing steroids to his wrestlers. That year the company would also lose their biggest star Hulk Hogan, who would sign for rival company WCW and later in 1994 testify against Vince McMahon in court. 1993 was certainly a strange time for wrestling fans in the West, but over in Japan things were ticking over relatively normally. Hulk Hogan himself would even have a dream match over there against the Great Muta, the then IWGP Heavyweight Champion. In fact, for those who have been living under a rock, wrestling has been a huge deal in Japan for a number of years, first exploding in popularity back in the 1950s, remaining extremely popular right up until this very day. Even during pro wrestling's height of popularity in the West, many members of the general public have always ignorantly looked down their noses at it, writing it off as the most lowbrow form of entertainment that could only possibly be enjoyed by the most uneducated members of society. From my experience working as a pro wrestler for over a decade, I can tell you that many UK theatre managers will still turn down bookings of pro wrestling shows, even though they can generate good money, simply due to the fact that there is still so much snobbery and bias in the arts against the trade. In Japan, on the other hand, it has always been a different kettle of fish, or should I say sushi, with the public generally offering a different level of respect to what it can get over here. This is probably in part due to the fact that it has often been traditionally depicted like a sport in the country, combined with the fact that Japan is culturally very different to the West to begin with. All in all, this has meant that wrestling in Japan has enjoyed popularity on par with baseball and sumo in the country, so it is no surprise that Capcom would want to develop a wrestling game considering that huge market was there. Outside of Japan, the majority of wrestling game offerings were poor licensed WWF games that had been published by LJN that did not really offer much appeal at all in terms of gameplay, but were simply marketed and sold on the fact that you could play as Hulk Hogan and all of your other favourites. Saturday Night Slam Masters, on the other hand, was a game that took the polar opposite approach to any of the WWF games that came before it, and was a game that was produced to offer primarily a great gameplay experience, over simply featuring a host of names who had appeared at WrestleMania. So thus far, I hope I've adequately managed to explain to you why a wrestling game would have been profitable for Capcom at the time. But from here, let's go over what makes this one so different to most wrestling games that are on the market. When powering on this arcade game, the intro pans up a muscled physique of a wrestler dressed like Hulk Hogan, who even emulates his well-known shirt ripping off pose. The scene may be a rip-off, but Hulk Hogan ripped off the Incredible Hulk. Everything is a rip-off of something else in some shape or form, I suppose. Before inserting a coin, the game shows demonstrations of the action and flashes up character bios for the playable wrestlers in this game, each of which we'll go over soon. The game's player select screen will instantly produce whiffs of Street Fighter 2 as players select from a lineup of colourful characters against a navy blue backdrop. Before a fight, the game informs players which country a match is taking place in, which once again falls in line with Street Fighter. After some cool entrances, a function we certainly never saw in Capcom's iconic fighting game, traditional wrestling matches get underway, but from a viewpoint commonly associated with the beat-em-up genre, rather than most wrestling games that came before this one. From the game's viewpoint to the timer and life bars at the top of the screen, the game has a lot of similarities with Street Fighter 2 and Final Fight. The similarities in aesthetics are as clear as day to see. In terms of gameplay, players have more range than in a traditional versus fighter and are not locked to a single plane. Instead, characters can move up and down as well as the usual left and right, allowing wrestlers to even be able to walk in front or behind one another. As you would expect, while Street Fighter 2 is mainly punch, kicks and projectiles, Saturday Night Slam Masters features a 3-button configuration which consists of a grab, attack and a jump button, with grappling obviously having a heavy emphasis in a wrestling game. Button combinations can also be used to take advantage of each playable character's 2 special attacks, which consist of non-grappling techniques and a finishing move. Since this is a wrestling game and not your typical versus fighter, victory is achieved via either pinning an opponent for a free count or forcing them to submit to a submission move. In terms of overall wrestling mechanics, they do not simply end there either, as like in pro wrestling on television, the ring itself is heavily utilised to add to the overall action in the game. Players can run against the ropes to gain momentum and perform attacks, or Irish whip an opponent against the ropes to hit them whilst they are in motion. This is all paired with some great animations depicting the elasticity of the ropes, and it gives this game a great layer of authenticity. The ring's 4 posts can be ascended to perform high-risk, high-reward aerial manoeuvres, and players can even climb out of the ring to wrestle on the hard floor outside. The game offers players a surprising amount of freedom. Also, whilst all versus fighters were famed at the time for offering one-on-one action, Saturday Night Slam Masters features the added bonus of allowing up to 4 players to duke it out simultaneously in the game's Team-Up Battle Royale mode. This mode basically allows for 2-on-2 matches where all 4 combatants compete in the ring simultaneously. This obviously functions well due to the amount of freedom of dimensional movements players have, meaning that the gameplay on screen never gets too congested. Innovative stuff. Now we have covered the functionality of this game, let's discuss why this game has links to Street Fighter that go way beyond the game's aesthetics, and the fact that it was developed by Capcom. Let's do this by looking at the game's incredible roster of wrestlers. The most famous and notable fighter in this game, which instantly links this game to the Street Fighter universe, is of course Mike Haggar, the mayor of Metro City who is playable in Final Fight, who, joined by Cody and Guy, set off on a quest to save his daughter from the Mad Gear gang. As we know, Final Fight is also part of the Street Fighter canon, in that many of the fighters would go on to appear in mainline Street Fighter games, first showing up within the Street Fighter Alpha series. In fact, Chun-Li also shows up eating a meal, a succulent Chinese meal, in the background in Final Fight 2, so there is that too. Pre-release Final Fight even went through a stage of being known as Street Fighter 89, and was to be considered the sequel to the previous 87 Street Fighter. However, the name was changed due to arcade vendors feeding back to Capcom that they felt the game was too different. The regular crossover appearances throughout Final Fight and Street Fighter's history confirms it is indeed all the same world. Speaking of such a universe, Captain Commando is actually from the same story canon too, since the whole game is set in Metro City in the future. Since the Captain and co have so much crime to try and clean up, maybe Mike Haggar failed in his duties to cleanse the city by spending too much time wrestling and not fulfilling his mayor duties. Although maybe that statement is a tad unfair based on the huge time gap between the story events of such games. It seems Saturday Night Slam Masters happened prior to what unfolded in Final Fight. It's just like Jesse the Body Ventura, Mike Haggar enjoyed a successful wrestling career prior to making the jump to politics. Speaking of ties back to real life, when Haggar wins his match, he lifts his daughter Jessica above his shoulder. which seems to be a nod to Macho Man and Miss Elizabeth in the WWF throughout the 80s. Apparently during this period where Mr. Haggar wrestled for the CWA, he also trained and mentored two of the other characters in the game, who also play an important role in all of this inter-game linkage. In the game's Team Battle Royal, there are 5 official combinations that the game will recognise and give a name to. Haggar's former trainees are a Russian wrestler known as Biff Slamkovich and an American known as Gunlock, collectively known as the Hypercannons. Story-wise, things begin to get a bit contrived here though, as the Japanese and Western releases of these games contain different information in the character bios at the start of the game. Biff Slamkovich, who can be considered as the main protagonist, is described as one of Mike Haggar's trainees in the Japanese version of this game. However, in the Western release, all associations to Mike Haggar were not mentioned, and instead, during Biff's losing quote, he references a wrestler known as Comrade Zangief, the USSR's famous fighter from Street Fighter II. All one can assume with the localization of this game is that whoever translated the game must have thought that Cold War prejudice was too high to associate an all-American character like Haggar with the likes of Slamkovich. Still, they couldn't have been that bothered about cultural insensitivity, as the bastards in the localization team wrote that Biff Slamkovich is from Kiev in Russia. Kiev in Russia. Maybe there are some secret Russian nationalists hiding amongst the Slam Masters localization team. Outside of this game, both Biff and his tag team partner and rival Gunlock had their tag team the Hypercannons mentioned in one of Hugo's endings in Street Fighter III The Second Impact, further linking the franchises together. In a further cameo, Biff even appears in the background of Ken's stage in Street Fighter Alpha 2. Speaking of Gunlock, he is nicknamed the Florida Wild Horse. This American wrestler, who also trained under Mike Haggar, apparently ended up falling out with Mike after making moves on his daughter Jessica. This apparently led to a fight between Gunlock and Cody after repeatedly harassing Jessica. Mike had had enough, leading to both of them getting into a serious fight and a situation reminiscent of the terrible story that took place in Rocky V. In regards to this character, in his bio in the Western version of the game, it states that he is rumoured to be related to a famous Street Fighter, which is hinted at throughout the game to be Guile, due to the two men's nationalities, looks and fighting style. On top of all of this, whilst the game itself is not canon, he is technically a playable character in Street Fighter the movie The Game, of all bloody things. A playable fighter appears in the game known as Blade, who functions as a Shadaloo agent. In Blade's ending, it is revealed that, hilariously, it was actually Gunlocked, acting as a deep cover agent the whole time. Now that's a weird Street Fighter fact. In the playable lineup of fighters, we also have the Great Oni, an athlete with a flashy wrestling style with a kabuki-like appearance, which in the game's story apparently came about due to American promoters requesting him to dress like that when making appearances on their shows. Which is a great little touch, as this was how Japanese wrestlers were usually represented in the country. Hell, they pretty much still are now. Inspiration for this fighter was mostly drawn from real-life pro wrestlers such as the Great Muta and the Great Kabuki. We then have Australian wrestler Alexander the Greater, who has probably the best backstory we have covered yet. In his home nation of Australia, this athlete had built himself a respectable rugby career, but in order to make even more money, he transferred what he had learned and moved to the USA to become an American footballer. Due to him being traditionally a rugby player and from a traditionally tougher sport than that girly padded stuff American sissies are into, he was considered too violent for the sport, so had to make the jump to pro wrestling to keep his career alive. Obviously, many Americans have a very different opinion of American football to the rest of the planet, so hilariously this amusing backstory was taken out of the translation, and Alexander the Greater would simply be rebilled as a butcher from Kentucky. Which is nowhere near as funny as the actual storyline that this Vader lookalike has. Next up we have a British wrestler known as Titanic Tim, a giant who was apparently born already weighing over 5 kilograms. Over in the UK, he is said to have trained with his tag team partner Birdie, who would soon quit wrestling to become a Street Fighter, obviously appearing in the Street Fighter series. Online sources state that he was apparently based on Giant Bubba, although personally I see no resemblance other than the height. Looking at the fact that this character is from England and that he wears a fur waist jacket, to me that suggests everyone else online is wrong, and inspiration seems to have been taken from Giant Haystacks, a mountain of a man who was once a household name in my country, who would go on to make a significant splash in Japan too. His career would come to an end as Loch Ness, as part of the Dungeon of Doom in WCW. How unfortunate. El Stingray is a Mexican luchador whose speed is unparalleled, who can take advantage of a range of mid-air assault techniques. Serving as the Great Arnie's greatest rival, this character seems to be based on and inspired by the late Mexican luchador Lizmark, and perhaps served inspiration himself for the debut of El Thirte in Street Fighter IV many years later. Out of the 8 playable fighters from single player mode, we have King Rastamon, known as Missing IQ Gomez. This ridiculous character from the mountains of the Dominican Republic reportedly knows little of the human language, but picked some up from watching cartoons. When he enters a ring, apparently his instincts take over and he goes wild. He is accompanied to the ring by a monkey known as Freak, who is said to have an IQ of over 200 and books all of this wrestler's matches for him. Rasta's design and fighting style are both reminiscent of Bruiser Brody, a gentleman who would have probably gone down in history to be one of the most famous wrestlers of all time if it were not for his murder. However, it is said that part of his sprite design, such as his beard and stance, are also reminiscent of former Dominican wrestler Jack Veneno. Finally, Saturday Night Slam Masters in the arcade featured 2 CPU boss characters, like many versus fighting games would over that period. The first of these is Jumbo Flapjack, a rotund fighter based on Earthquake, who also has a strong resemblance to Zangief, and finally his master known simply as the Scorpion. The Scorpion's look is heavily modelled off of the Tiger Mask gimmick from Japan, a gimmick donned by multiple different performers. Part of the reason that the characters in this game look so great is that they were first drawn by Tetsuya Hara, a man responsible for the illustrations found in Fist of the North Star and other mangas. After defeating him against Cast and winning the Capcom Wrestling Alliance's championship, much like Art of Fighting, this game ends on a cliffhanger, with the promotion's founder Victor Ortega, who we briefly saw in the game's introduction, challenging the player for the belt, before the credits finally roll. Before we move on further, I guess it is about time that we bring up the second title released in the Saturday Night Slam Masters Muscle Bomber series, simply known as Muscle Bomber Duo. You see, like Street Fighter II, the original Slam Masters game would receive an updated iteration, essentially creating a sort of Slam Masters Champion Edition, if you will. Muscle Bomber Duo remarkably never had its name localised in the West. This one focuses purely on the tag team side of things, with further new additions such as the introduction of the ability for gamers to choose the same character twice, through the implementation of different colour palette swaps. Characters also gain more special moves, and some of the game's controls have seen changes. In regards to the original game, it was ported to a few home consoles. One of these was of course the Super Nintendo, which offered perhaps the most well-known conversion of this game. Like Street Fighter II, as you can see, the graphics in this title have been scaled back somewhat to that of the arcade original, but most of the spirit of the gameplay has been maintained. Even the Team Battle Royale mode allows up to 4-player action and is still accessible using the Super Nintendo's multi-tap adapter, which is a surprise to be sure, but a welcome one. To be fair, the Mega Drive version of the game is similarly impressive. Sadly, 4-player action is not included in this one, but to compensate for its shortfalls, a deathmatch mode was added, and Jumbo and Scorpion were made playable in single-player mode. Nice. The most obscure version of Muscle Bomber appeared exclusively in Japan for the FM Towns, with myself borrowing Guru Larry's copy in the past. I played this game on the 32-bit FM Towns Marty home console, and as you can see, it is visually more impressive than the Super Nintendo and Mega Drive versions of the game, and offers CD audio quality too. This is basically the Final Fight CD of Muscle Bomber home ports, meaning it was the best home conversion around, offering the best sound. However, graphically, it's still not quite as good as the arcade original. To be fair, no matter what version you play of this game, they are all pretty damn good, without a stinker amongst them, and all give players access to arguably the ultimate wrestling game in existence from back in 1993. To be honest, I personally think the game will offer players a ton of fun, even if they are not into wrestling and just enjoy versus fighters in general. The game offers all of the usual charm of fighting games from Capcom's golden age. There is no doubt that back in 1993, Saturday Night Slam Masters really did bring a lot to the table. Most wrestling games released on home consoles in the West were published by LJN and were sold on the basis that you could play as your favourite wrestler from the WWF, rather than being developed with any real intent of offering a top-level gameplay experience. Saturday Night Slam Masters was so different as it puts gameplay first and at the forefront, above the use of famous celebrities and big brands to make a quick sale. Aesthetically, the game's characters, sprites and other elements of the game look graphically very similar to Street Fighter 2, and as mentioned earlier, the game's lore even ties the two together. For example, we can play as Gunlock, who is said to be Guile's brother, and more importantly, we can play as Mike Haggar from Final Fight, a franchise that has existed in the same universe as Street Fighter from day one. The events of this game may occur within the Street Fighter universe, but very different gameplay is presented to the players, and as a result, people loved this game in the arcades, and it would receive some of the best home conversions of any game. After the release of the second arcade iteration, known as Muscle Bomber Duo, the third Slam Masters game and true sequel to the original would finally arrive in 1994. The wrestling game sequel would be the first game in the series developed to run off of Capcom's new Capcom System 2 arcade board, the same hardware used for the Street Fighter Alpha series. While this may sound like an excellent, exciting proposition, sadly this game would drop many of the features included within the previous iterations that made Slam Masters so special to begin with, which we shall discuss more on shortly. Before we move ahead, I feel it is important to touch a little more on Capcom itself in 1994. Overall, that year seemed to be a period where Capcom as a company were really doubling down on trying to make money from Street Fighter 2. They seemed more focused than ever before in looking for new ways to milk the possibilities the game presented them with. When it comes to this, you don't have to look very far at all to see why this would have been the case, as 1994 was the year that the high-budget live-action Street Fighter movie starring Jean-Claude Van Damme saw release. So with Capcom and its versus fighters being more mainstream than at any point in history before, it seemed to make commercial sense to carry on feeding off of the brand. The console and arcade games based on the movie would not be ready until 1995, but Capcom would push out yet another edition of Street Fighter 2, Super Street Fighter 2 Turbo, a game that is most notable for featuring Akuma as a hidden opponent at the end of the game. The company would also famously use the Super Street Fighter engine to create and release Darkstalkers that year, a sort of Street Fighter 2 Lite featuring an entirely different coat of paint from any previous Capcom fighters. On top of this though, there was another game that seemed to use the Street Fighter engine once again, which for some reason seems to receive nowhere near as much coverage. This game is of course Ring of Destruction Slam Masters 2, or as it's known in Japan, Super Muscle Bomber The International Blowout, which naming wise seems to be a nod to Super Street Fighter 2 The New Challenges, as in both games they brought each respective franchise to the CP2 hardware for the first time. Immediately upon starting up this arcade exclusive, the game informs players that the title's character illustrations are by Tetsuo Hara, the same gentleman who worked on Saturday Night Slam Masters, and the same gentleman behind the artwork in Fist of the North Star. At first glance, you will instantly notice the game's format has been completely changed from the previous entry, and that this title functions as a very traditional one-on-one 2D fighter. The freedom of movement found in the previous game is now absent, and instead players are restricted to fighting on one simple 2D plane. Obviously just like in Street Fighter 2 and many of its iterations. Speaking of restrictions, the 4-player functionality found in Saturday Night Slam Masters has also been completely dropped from Slam Masters 2, meaning that only one-on-one matches are now possible. Victory is not even achievable through pinfall, submission or countout anymore either. And once again, like Street Fighter 2, victory can only be achieved by knocking out or doing more damage to an opponent within a time limit. Slam Masters 2 really is a traditional fighting game. The best way to describe the game is a wrestling themed versus fighter rather than an actual wrestling game. To emphasise the versus fighter playstyle further, the game even includes a combo counter, like many other fighters from the time period. Unique to the game though, that I suppose does separate it from Street Fighter 2 somewhat, is at least the game's controls. Players can still whip their opponents against the ropes to perform drop kicks and clotheslines, and there is a heavy emphasis on grappling moves. To be fair to Capcom, there are certainly still some pro wrestling elements that remain intact in this game's fighting gameplay. It is possible in the game to reverse grapples by tapping on the grapple button immediately after being grappled by an opponent. Adding further to this combat feature, arcade units let players use the traditional layout of 2 kicks and 2 punch buttons, however an additional grappling button is added to the mix. Like any versus fighter from Capcom, really victory is achieved by winning 2 out of 3 rounds by depleting opponents' life bars. It is of note that these are twice as long as those found within the Street Fighter series. Believe it or not, this game features a mechanic similar to that of Samurai Showdown, which we have covered on here already at an earlier date in an old Samurai Showdown upload. Basically, fighters can take a lot of damage and become enraged and turn red for a limited time, making their attacks stronger during this process. This gives a last gasp of hope to those wrestlers who are literally against the ropes. If you played this game back in the day expecting a faithful sequel to Saturday Night Slam Masters, you would have certainly been disappointed. However, if you went into this game with an open mind, or went into playing the title expecting a traditional fighter, then there is certainly fun to be had here, and plenty to see. In fact, the Ring of Destruction name is even accurate, as with the right execution, matches can be finished by literally slamming an opponent through the ring itself. Nice. The game includes all 10 of the wrestlers who appeared as fighters in the previous game, along with an additional 4 all-new playable characters, which once again is similarly shared with Super Street Fighter 2. The game, like its predecessor, has its own narrative to help explain the appearance of some of the new fighters, along with reasons for much of the game's action taking place in the first place. The previous game of Saturday Night Slam Masters ends on a cliffhanger with Capcom Wrestling Alliance owner Victor Ortega announcing he wants to come out of retirement and wrestle with the promotion's new champion. This means that Victor Ortega functions as one of the game's 4 new playable characters and also functions as the final challenge for those who can make it all the way to the end of this game. Ortega is very much positioned as the top dog in the game, which is emphasised further every time he emulates Hulk Hogan's trademark poses. In the previous game, Blood Wrestling Alliance members Jumbo Flapjack and the Scorpion served as some of the game's final challenges, who were trying to take control of CWA. Both of these men are back in action in Ring of Destruction, and are even joined by further BWA members. First we have Rip Saber, who like Triple Bloody H, wields a shovel as his main weapon. Whilst on the surface it may appear that he may be some sort of nod to Sergeant Slaughter, or even Bret Hart, bearing in mind that he is from Calgary, in reality he actually seems to be based off of another Calgary-based wrestler known as Cole Moffat, who was once very well known in Japan. Rip Saber, like Moffat, inflicts pain more with improvised weapons than his actual wrestling ability. In fact, Moffat partook in many matches involving fire and explosives, which makes this character make a lot more sense. Next up we have Wrath, who is certainly one of the wackier characters in the game. To describe this man, he is the equivalent to The Undertaker, or Papa Shango, but turned up to 11. With access to demonic powers not even possible in the real world of professional wrestling, a statement that is a bit paradoxical in itself, this character from New Delhi I would describe as basically undead Dalsim, and he is probably the most out there of them all. Included in the game, he even references Kali, a blood-drinking Hindu goddess, in his wing quote. All in all, a very creative addition to the character roster. I myself found myself playing the most in the game as Black Widow, a character to me that felt like they offered the best combination of speed and power. This flamboyant character, that is almost androgynous looking in appearance, is revealed at the end of the game to actually be a woman. Advertisements for this game purposely used neutral Japanese pronouns to leave it up in the air whether or not the character was a male or female, contributing to the Samus-like reveal at the end of the game. It is said that the character was modelled after Mariko Yoshida, a female wrestler known for her flexibility, muscles and a full body costume with a Black Widow spider motif. By now you've probably noticed many of the beautiful stages this game offers. Whilst the gameplay may not be as dynamic and original as its predecessor, we cannot deny that the stages themselves look great. There are lots of nice subtle details too, such as some of the baddies from the BWA having chains instead of ring ropes on the rings of their stages. The visual appeal is great, so there is much more to see in that regard than with the likes of Saturday Night Slam Masters. I am once again going to pedantically nitpick with regards to some of the geography included in the title. I already noted that in the first Slam Masters game they stated that Biff Slamkovich was from Kiev, Russia, but with this one they bodged the geography once more. Geography doesn't seem a strong point for Japanese fighting game devs, as I have noted in the past that England in the first King of Fighters is represented with a Union flag, the flag of Great Britain rather than England. And in a further Capcom SNK crossover, I have seen Morrigan from Darkstalkers listed from Edinburgh in England, the city that functions as the freaking capital of Scotland. While Ring of Destruction has no geographical howlers as bad as these, it does state Rip Saber is from Calgary, Canada. And for some reason, Haggar from Final Fight is now from New York City, instead of Metro City. even though Metro City is a huge part of Capcom lore. Now I know Metro City is based on New York anyway, but would it have hurt that much to maintain a bit of continuity between Capcom games? Pedantry to one side, Ring of Destruction Slam Masters 2 is a decent game. It is just simply not the game Saturday Night Slam Masters fans would have wanted, and instead is a shameless yet decent Super Street Fighter 2 clone. Though what could have been though are certainly a missed opportunity. Just imagine how good it would have been if Capcom developed this game to play like the original, but added the 4 new characters to the mix with all the cool new backdrops. It is a shame really, as that would have been really special, rather than another decent versus fighter, which there was no shortage of in the world anyway. But at least the Slam Masters sequel does exist, in some form I suppose, which is something. The game will forever remain more obscure than most Capcom games from the period, as most arcade units were sold in just Japan and Germany, with only a few being placed elsewhere. In fact, from what I could see at least, it looks like this game had missed out on a US release altogether, meaning that the biggest gaming market in the world was deprived of this game. This probably plays into why we hear so little about this title now, considering Americans make up such a large portion of voices within the English-speaking gaming community online. Personally, I love a good old-fashioned deep dive into the lesser talked about games, particularly those that are so strongly linked to popular critically acclaimed classics. I hope you enjoyed learning today about the overlooked Slam Masters trilogy. So if you want to learn more about overlooked wrestling games, subscribe and check out my video on Rumble Roses right now. It's sexy. Yeah, cheerio.